year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the United States. Child trafficking cases can occur in metropolitan areas, wealthy suburbs, and rural areas. Traffickers can be family members, acquaintances, partners, or strangers. Child trafficking investigations have occurred in every state. Human trafficking is a global crisis, much like poverty and hunger. There are no easy answers or quick fixes. Rather, ending it will require continued collaboration of advocacy organizations, law enforcement, governments, and individuals. For more information on human trafficking, contact the Office of School Safety and Security by either phone or email, or visit our page at the Department of Education website.
Hello, my name is Cindy Swearingen with the Office of School Safety and Security, Oklahoma State Department of Education. I'd like to welcome you to this month's webinar, Human Trafficking and How It Relates to Schools. And we have an excellent guest, and we're very excited to have Mr. Mike Snowden. Mr. Snowden is the agent in charge with the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, and he is in charge of human trafficking. And so really he needs no introduction, so I will just turn it over to him. Welcome, Mr. Snowden, and please introduce yourself, and then we'll move right on into our questions. Thank you.
And thank you for the invitation from the Department of Education to be part of this webinar on human trafficking. And my name is Mike Snowden, and I have been a police officer in this state for 38 years. The last decade, I have been so very fortunate to be the supervisor for the state's human trafficking unit run by the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics. I have a half dozen agents, and we cover the entire state from Boise City to Miami and Walters to Idabel. So we've got the whole thing covered. We're excited to be able to share with you today about human trafficking. And as Mrs. Swearingen said, sometimes it's not the most obvious crime. It is a covert crime, and it has become a state issue since 2012. Prior to that, it was a federal issue because we had all seen the movie Taken, and we knew that human traffickers were most likely foreign nationals who came here and snatched up our young ladies and took them overseas and sold them at auctions. What we've learned in the past decade is that couldn't be further from the truth. What's actually occurring in Oklahoma is what we call pimp-controlled prostitution. And it's happening right under our noses. And it's very, very hard to detect unless you're in that industry and sort of know what to look for. So as the introduction alluded to, unless you know your students well, unless you know your coworkers and those who are around you well, it's almost impossible to tell what's going on in their home life, in their private life, and outside of the school setting. So I'm happy to be here today to answer any questions that might come up, and we'll talk about what human trafficking is, and more importantly, what it is not.
Are sex crimes against children the same as human trafficking?
A great question. Child abuse and sexual assault on a minor is not the same thing as human trafficking. Although minors, those under 18, can and certainly are victims of human trafficking. Human trafficking involves the element of commercial sex. That is prostitution for someone else's profit, someone else's financial or personal gain. Unfortunately, sexual abuse of minors, sexual assault on children, child abuse, those sort of activities occur, as does human trafficking throughout the state of Oklahoma. But those are a different sort of category of crime. We, as human trafficking investigators, are looking for those defendants, those perpetrators that profit financially from the sexual activity of others. and those others may be adults who are being forced into prostitution or minors who cannot consent to prostitution. And of course, I need to define prostitution simply as sex for something of value for someone else. We certainly have uh, independent prostituted persons throughout the state of Oklahoma. We have those who are convinced that the economy is such that they must do that to survive. But then the human trafficking victims that we deal with are minors who are engaged in prostitution and they can't consent, or adults over 18 who are being forced into such a situation. So there is a significant difference between the two.
Are our state's public schools at risk for human trafficking?
So the public schools is really just a collection of all kinds of diverse people who are out in our communities. And so, although there's no what I would call organized human trafficking, like within a school, there certainly are people who are in the school who are vulnerable. And that includes all of us. At certain times in our life, we're all vulnerable. We're vulnerable when we're young and when we're old and when we're financially struggling. The biggest vulnerability in the state of Oklahoma right now are those who are financially unable to make choices because they can't afford choices in their lives. So uh, the schools most likely to be at risk are obviously the schools with the most population. Um, I love to use the example that a child may be recruited from any town in the state of Oklahoma. And I use the example of Walika and Waukeeta and Winoka and Wewoka and Wacomas and all the W towns that have small population, but they all have the internet. They all have the World Wide Web. And so our kids are on the internet. They're making themselves a little bit vulnerable because of that activity. They're talking to people that they do not know. Now, however, although that child may be vulnerable and recruited on the internet, the child is or adult either, is most likely to be trafficked in a larger population area where the population is transient. And by transient, I mean those places, for example, Altus and Lawton and Stillwater and the Oklahoma City metro area and the Tulsa metro area, where the population comes and goes and no one's paying attention. For example, in Altus, there's an Air Force base. And although it's a small town, there are a lot of hotels, there's a lot of people moving in and out, and nobody's paying attention. It would be almost exceedingly impossible to traffic a young person, say in a community the size of Walika. First of all, there's no hotel there. Second of all, everyone knows everyone else, and it's most likely to cause significant attention or problems. So the primary areas in the state of Oklahoma are those cities or towns with transient population. And that, can include schools as well. It's not uncommon in the bigger communities, the larger populations, for children to be in and out of schools. And it gets very, very easy to lose track of them, and adults as well.
What are some red flags or warning signs that educators would need to know?
What's interesting is I've been married to a fifth grade science teacher for 30 years. She's been in the classroom for 30 years. And it's interesting to watch the dynamic of teacher and student change over the last 3 decades. But I would again repeat that if you don't know your students, if you don't get involved in their personal lives, it's almost impossible for you to tell if something's going on with them. But especially with minors, what we tend to see is attendance issues. We tend to see problems, obviously, at home. Maybe a parent who's absent, or maybe a parent who simply doesn't control the situation their child is in. The younger the student and the more hypersexualized they are, those can be red flags. we, little kids act out, and they act out on what they see and hear. They repeat what they see and hear at home or on television or on the playground. So hypersexuality among very young, I'm talking about middle school or that kind of age, can be a red flag. But again, I wish there was a way I could send it to you and say, look for this, and if this, and this occurs, well, you've got a human trafficking victim. Much like, 20 years ago when I was teaching drug enforcement classes to teachers, and teachers would want to know, how do I tell if my kids are on drugs? And my answer was always, well, you really can't unless you know them. If you have a child that's typically quiet and controlled, and all of a sudden their behavioral problem, that's an issue. If you have a child that's typically wild and uncontrolled, and they're sitting quietly in their chair, maybe a conversation needs to occur. So we look at those sort of things, changes in typical behavior, uh, troubled home lives, and hypersexualization as things that might want to cause some concern and some questions.
Does social media play a role in human trafficking?
Now, it's interesting. I love to point out that the internet is not evil. The internet is an inanimate object. I mean, it can't be good or evil, but can be used for either. And the most frightening statistic, and I'm not going to try to quote it because I'm sure it's changed since I read it, but a majority of our children, those under 18, I refer to as children, are actively engaged in conversation with people on the internet that they simply don't know. That's the number one preventative measure that we can take to protect our children. Very, very small school system in northeastern Oklahoma. We encountered a 16-year-old young lady whose mom had taken her phone away from her, and the young lady's best friend told mom, "Hey, you need to look at that phone." When mom reviewed the contents of that phone, she almost didn't recognize her daughter. She was on Facebook, which is seemingly innocent, but she was on Facebook portraying herself as something she simply was not. She was from a very small town, but she had adopted this persona of sort of a street gangster type youth, with the language and the throwing signs, and again the hypersexualization, and she had attracted the attention of an adult male that she was talking to, and had no idea who he was. The conversation had gone to the point where he had told her he was going to pick her up and take her to Tulsa, and that she could make a lot of money engaged in sex with people that he knew, that she did not know. So much to the point that she had sort of painted herself into this corner, and she had agreed to do that. Fortunately for us, he kept referring to this summer, and we didn't know exactly why he was waiting. And what we found out when we looked at his IP address is he was in prison, and he was arranging for income when he got out of prison. He was about to be paroled. So, number one, most preventable sort of thing, especially with young people, is who are they talking to on the internet, and who are those people? Again, the internet is not evil, social media is not evil, but there are certainly predators lurking around out there. And if you're not paying attention to who your kids are talking to, chances are someone else is paying attention to them.
Who is at greatest risk to become a human trafficking victim?
The population at greatest risk for human trafficking might surprise you, because my attitude about this has literally changed in the last 2 years. We used to consider youth, 15, 16-year-olds as probably the most at risk. I know that the popular myth is that prostitution begins around 12. we simply don't see that in Oklahoma. Um, if you're wandering around from motel to motel with a 12-year-old, someone's going to pay attention. Someone's going to see that and not like the parents of that and report that. So what we were seeing were 15, 16-year-old, primarily females, who were most at risk. Recently, his whole new subculture has sort of come to light that is most at risk, and it might surprise you, but they're 19 to 26-year-olds who are enrolled in college. Um, they're having financial issues, trying to pay their tuition, trying to pay car payments, trying to stay off of mom and dad's checkbook, and literally having huge financial issues. There is a legitimate, although thinly disguised website out there called Seeking Arrangements. Our college girls, 19 to 26 years old, are advertising themselves on Seeking Arrangements, looking for what we so flippantly call sugar daddies, adult males with disposable income who are willing to assist these young ladies in paying their rent, their car payment, their tuition, in exchange for sex a given number of times in a month or a week or whatever. What's interesting is I recently got to interview almost a dozen of these young ladies, and none of them considered that activity prostitution. But all of them were preyed upon by a predator within that site. A man who was not looking for a simple sexual relationship for money. He didn't even try to hide it. He was running an escort service. And by the time we ended the investigation, we had identified at least 15 young women who he had literally turned into full-time prostitutes. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't flippantly refer to these sugar daddies and those sorts of arrangements as harmless and sort of something that we could let happen, because there are predators out there who are preying on those girls because they've already displayed a vulnerability. So it's very easily exploited.
What are the most prevalent motivations behind human traffickers?
Okay, so in Oklahoma, as in many, many other states, we divide human trafficking into three sort of different categories. Commercial sex, we've already talked about, prostitution for the financial advantage of someone else, someone not the prostituted person, but someone else. What we used to refer to as a pimp or a trafficker. So commercial sex can include prostitution, dancing in strip clubs, any kind of sexualized activity for profit. The second category is obviously forced labor. Forced labor is very, very difficult to investigate. We do see forced labor in the state of Oklahoma, but we can't force people to become victims. For example, if you're a foreign national and you're working in Oklahoma's growing marijuana industry, and I look at your work situation and think, oh, I would never do that. I wouldn't live in those conditions. I wouldn't engage in that activity for that amount of money. And I consider you to be victimized. You may not consider yourself a victim. You may refuse to cooperate with law enforcement or the government in general. And there's absolutely nothing I can do about that. So we see labor trafficking in various forms in the state of Oklahoma, although those issues are really, really hard to investigate, really, really hard to prosecute. And thirdly, um, it's a sort of a mislabeled type of trafficking called trafficking in children. And people think of that as sex trafficking, but it's not. Trafficking in children is, in layman's terms, adoption fraud. Adoption fraud is typically perpetrated by an expectant mother who has sold, for example, the rights to the adoption of her child to multiple different adoption agencies. Fortunately, in Oklahoma, that doesn't occur that often. The adoption arena in the state of Oklahoma is fairly small, and it's a close knit society or sort of culture, and they all know each other, and so the opportunities for that kind of crime are limited. So again, commercial sex, forced labor, and trafficking in children or adoption fraud are the three that we see, and commercial sex, of course, is the by far most prominent.
Has the legalization of medical marijuana affected human trafficking?
The medical marijuana industry in Oklahoma has vastly increased what I consider labor trafficking in the state, um, but it hasn't actually had much of an effect on the trafficking prosecutions because, as I sort of alluded to a minute ago, there's only two crimes in the statutes that I can make you be a victim. One is domestic abuse. If your partner has assaulted you within a period of time and the police intervene, they can make an arrest without your permission. They can literally make you be a victim. The other is homicide, in which case you can't object to being a victim. So a victim of labor trafficking is so totally voluntary. I cannot force someone to testify. I cannot force someone to cooperate with us against their employer. And so we look at the situations of those engaged in the medical marijuana, particularly the grow industry, not so much the retail, but the growing industry. And I look at them and say, well, I would never live in those conditions. I would never work in those conditions. I certainly don't think that it's fair. But if that's the employment they have chosen and they don't consider themselves victims, there's really very little we can do about it. Nor do I, in my personal opinion, nor do I think we would want to live in a society where the government could just come in and say, hey, your conditions are not favorable. We're going to consider you a victim, and you're going to have to testify whether you'd like to or not. So it's an interesting dynamic. We have 8,000 plus marijuana grows in the state of Oklahoma, significantly more than they do in the state of California. We have thousands of dispensaries as well. So it's a big industry in the state. So we're watching that carefully.
What effects has COVID-19 had on human trafficking?
The effects of COVID on human trafficking have been negligible. I don't, other than occasionally my investigators have been exposed and quarantined, and it kind of makes manpower a little chancy at times. The young ladies engaged in prostitution that I've had the opportunity to talk to in the past several years, not terribly concerned with COVID or anything else. They've got to make money. So, especially if their symptoms are mild, they're still working. And they're unfortunately exposing portions of the population who then might carry that home or whatever. I haven't seen anyone wearing masks in that industry. So yeah, it's not had a lot of effect on what we're seeing going on in especially the prostitution industry.
How would you define grooming, and how does it relate to human trafficking?
In the human trafficking investigation world, we divide the act of trafficking into sort of three subcategories. There's recruitment. First of all, just simply identifying someone who's vulnerable. Um, if they have been sexually abused or have absent parents or are an adult in financial um, difficulties, those folks are subject to recruitment. Grooming is sort of the second part of that, where the perpetrator, the trafficker, will convince someone that it's in their best interest to uh, engage in a relationship with them that at first may even be sort of a romantic relationship, but then it very quickly turns into a financial relationship. Um, the urban myth that human trafficking victims are kidnapped could not be further from the truth. In fact, in a decade of investigating human trafficking, I've seen one example of a kidnapping victim, and that was in Ohio or some northeastern state where a young lady was using methamphetamine with people that she did not know, and sort of came to her senses in another state, engaged in prostitution. Literally in Oklahoma, we do not, please believe me, we do not see kidnapping victims trafficked. Um, if I kidnap someone, I have an immediate physical problem controlling them. I can't leave them alone. People are looking for them, and it's just too much risk. Most likely, I have identified someone as a trafficker. I've identified them as being vulnerable or in need. I have convinced them that I have their best interest at heart, that we're going to engage in this financial relationship where they're going to have sex with strangers for profit, and then I'm going to share in that profit for whatever I'm providing: security, internet ads, whatever I can convince them. And that simply, most of these guys are what we call Romeo traffickers. They're engaged in relationships with these young men and women, and then they exploit that relationship financially. So that's sort of what we call recruitment and grooming, and then the actual trafficking. Um, those that engage in physical violence with the people that they're in relationships with have earned the nickname guerrilla pimps. They get pretty violent. Those are the cases that are easy to identify and prosecute because we have physical injury. The vast majority of the cases, however, are just a simple matter of coercion and exploiting a romantic or good relationship.
What are the most important takeaways for school staff to understand about human trafficking?
The most important thing to understand about human trafficking in Oklahoma is that it occurs. It occurs here. It's here. Um, the thing that I want you to take away from this session is, please avoid urban myth. There are not boogeymen from somewhere else coming here and trafficking our young ladies and boys. It's us. We're doing it. It's Oklahoma people trafficking Oklahoma people. The interstates have absolutely nothing to do with human trafficking. There was human trafficking in Oklahoma before there were interstates. There was human trafficking in Oklahoma before there were roads. It's an industry that's been going on for forever. The roads are simply a transportation device. We in Oklahoma tend to blame our location for our vices, and it could not be further from the truth. So the roads have nothing to do with it. Kidnapping has nothing to do with it. There are, please, criminals walking around at Walmart and Target and Hobby Lobby, but they're not human traffickers. Human traffickers are not going to follow you around. They're not looking for soccer moms at Target. They are looking for people they can begin a relationship with and exploit. So those are two things that we combat constantly. The other thing that I would like to point out really quickly is we have a human smuggling problem in the United States. So when you see, for example, 12 Guatemalans in a van and they're moving from point A to point B, again, not human trafficking, human smuggling. Human smuggling is consensual and contractual, and everybody involved in it is violating federal laws. Federal laws in which law enforcement in Oklahoma, state and county and local, have no jurisdiction. Before you repost that sort of glamorous, exciting post on Facebook, research it, see if it's true, first of all. Even some of my friends in law enforcement have tended to do that over the past decade or so. I've made many a phone call to friends saying, hey, that post is ridiculous. They're not putting $20 bills on your windshield wipers and then snatching you up and selling you into sex slavery. Guys, that may be tremendous as the movie of the week, but it's not what real life looks like in trafficking. So that being said, we have a hotline number that is available. Everybody has a hotline number now. All of the nonprofit organizations, the actual service providers all have hotlines. And I will endeavor to get that. If we could, we'll post that with this training. I don't have it like with me right this very second, but we'll post that as we can. There was something else I was going to add on that, but trafficking can involve boys as well. Unfortunately, in Oklahoma, we sort of have a climate, not a very forgiving climate for male victims. If a male victim were to walk into a police department or make his story public in some way, he might expect some criticism. He might expect some skepticism. And so, although there are male victims of human trafficking in Oklahoma, we don't tend to see them coming forward very often. And that's a climate that we need to think about addressing and think about how we can fix. We need to give just as much credence to male victims as we do every other victim. So I could go on for a long time about this issue, but it is a serious issue. And I like to say this, we don't rescue anyone. All law enforcement does is simply identify someone who has been victimized and then give them an opportunity to engage on a different path. Interestingly, only about 15% of victims come through law enforcement. The majority of them directly go to nonprofit service providers. And there are many of them throughout the state. There are 3 that are certified by the Attorney General's office that we use. The first is Dragonfly Home. Dragonfly Home is a service provider here in Oklahoma City. And they provide all kinds of services to victims, victims who can come to them without going through law enforcement. The second would be The Spring, SPRING. The Spring is in Sand Springs, Oklahoma. They are a faith-based service provider who provides, again, shelter, food, clothing, financial resources, job opportunities to survivors of human trafficking. And then lastly, in Tulsa is DVIS, Domestic Violence Intervention system, DVIS. They provide resources to survivors as well. The other thing, my friends, before I forget again, is it's almost impossible to tell what a trafficker looks like. One of the most common myths is trafficker looks like Huggy Bear on the old movie Starsky and Hutch, right? We have this sort of mental picture in our head about what a trafficker looks like. And it might surprise you to know that a good 10 to 15% of our traffickers in Oklahoma are familial. They're family members, trafficking their children, their nieces, their nephews, mostly mothers. We see mothers trafficking their daughters. We've seen it anywhere from Stillwell, Oklahoma, to Altus, Oklahoma. Mothers trafficking their daughters. We've seen very, very successful female traffickers. One of the most successful was a 43-year-old white woman who lived in the suburbs of Mustang, Oklahoma. So keep an open mind when we talk about trafficking. It can, the victims can be anybody that's vulnerable. The traffickers can be people that you would not suspect, and the result can be very, very significant for the state of Oklahoma. Fortunately, we have a great group of service providers in this state. This is something that we can stop, literally. We teach our boys from the classroom, from the home, from the grandparents, from aunts and uncles, in your churches. We teach our boys it's not okay to rent women. It's not okay to buy sex. Sex is about intimacy, not about commerce. We teach our girls that they are worth more than that. That no matter how desperate their situation seems, that they are worth more than that amount of money. So guys, when we do that, when we accomplish that, when we attach a stigma to the purchasers of sex, we stop human trafficking. Without demand, there would be no human trafficking in the state of Oklahoma. This is a demand-driven activity. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and share with you. I tend to ramble, but I'm very passionate about this topic. The Bureau of Narcotics Human Trafficking Unit is always available to answer questions for you, to look at things for you, and to provide guides to resources should you need them.
Thank you, Mr. Snowden, for that training. We really appreciate it. Really brought a lot of really good information out. As always, if you would like some information or some additional professional development, reach out to us here at the Office of School Safety and Security. We'd be happy to provide that training. Or Mr. Snowden is available at the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, and you can reach out to him at his website, and he'll provide additional training as well. We hope to see you next month. Thank you.